Hello, I'm Jen Benner from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and I'm happy to welcome you to the webinar, Understanding the Roles of SARTs and Behavioral Intervention Teams, BITs, in the Campus Setting. This is one of many webinars you can find in the SART Toolkit at nsvrc.org/SART Toolkit. This webinar is one of two related to campus SART work. Please visit the SART Toolkit to find the second webinar entitled Effective Campus SARTs, Assessing the Work, Creating Buy-in, and Navigating Community Overlap for more information. NSVRC would like to thank the Office for Victims of Crime for their support and funding of this webinar and the entire SART Toolkit. We would also like to offer the disclaimer that the opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed are those of the contributors and do not necessarily represent that official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Again, the link to the SART Toolkit is www.nsvrc.org/SART Toolkit. And for those of you who are looking for a deeper dive into more resources, lists of subject matter experts, please visit the SART Toolkit at the link shown. I'm so glad our presenters could join us today, and so now I'm going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves and talk about their work.
Hi there, my name is Michael Blackman. As you can see my school right there, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, SAIC. I will have our contact information a little bit later down in the webinar. My role is in student affairs at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I oversee our student conduct processes, oversee our student support initiatives, and meet with the majority of students here who report being a victim of some kind of sexual misconduct on campus.
Great, thanks, Michael. My name is Jill Dunlap, and I am the Director for Research at NASPA, which is Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Education. It's a national higher education association based out of Washington, D.C. Prior to my work at NASPA, I worked at 3 different institutions in primarily the role of supporting survivors of sexual violence.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jessica Heredia, and I'm with the University of California, San Diego as the Assistant Director of CARE, which is our Survivor Advocacy Center. I've worked in this field for over 10 years, and in my current role, I primarily am involved in case management, policy and protocol development, implementation, and training.
Hello, everyone. My name is Danica Wolf, and I am from the University of Missouri. I am adjunct faculty in the School of Social Work and Women's and Gender Studies, teaching the domestic violence class. And I am the former coordinator of the Relationship and Sexual Violence Prevention Center, which is a dedicated intervention, prevention, and education space, primarily focused on the needs of survivors and supporters.
Great. Thanks, everyone, so much for the introductions. And this is Jill, and I will be facilitating our conversation today with our expert panelists. And we're really lucky to have everyone who's been able to join us as a presenter on this call to talk about the differences between sexual assault response teams in the campus setting and behavioral intervention teams. So SARTs and BITs may not be the most recognizable terms to some of the community folks who work with campuses around sexual and dating and domestic violence prevention and response. So this hopefully will be a good introduction to those teams on campus so that community agencies who are working with campuses in terms of providing prevention and response can better understand the different roles that each of these teams has on a campus. And then for those folks who work on campus, this is also a really great opportunity and sort of a deep dive into what best practices look like in terms of the way that these teams can overlap and how they really should collaborate. So with that being said, I will turn it over to Danica to talk through a little bit about what a campus SART is.
Thanks so much, Jill. We know that sexual violence affects so many aspects of a survivor's life and often leads to complex issues and questions. On a campus, we also know that can be even more of a tangled web of confusing and intimidating offices and procedures that even our most astute professionals don't always understand. So sexual assault response teams, or SARTs, help survivors through that maze of services that are available, kind of a menu of services possibly, and uses the experiences of those survivors to help improve services. SART can also be made up of any number of offices, agencies, departments, and professionals who may intersect with a survivor, a respondent, or a supporter at any point after an incident. That's kind of my best way to sum up a SART.
Great. Thanks so much, Danica. And so now I'll turn over to you, Michael, to talk a little bit about behavioral intervention teams and the difference between what Danica just described and then what this group does on a campus.
Sure. So a behavioral intervention team, or a BIT, as in general would be a multidisciplinary team that meets pretty regularly, and their focus is on tracking red flags, looking for trends, patterns in individual or group behavior. So they're broadly looking at problematic or concerning behavior on their campus. In some cases, the BITs also respond to high-level incidents or high-level student concerns. And I'll just put this caveat up front, which I'll say over the next few slides. There's going to be a lot of variance in what a BIT looks like, what a SART looks like, based on the particular campus needs. So what I'll be describing is just broadly what I believe is typical, but certainly this can vary based on particular institutional needs. So in general, a BIT is not going to be housed in any one office. It's a multidisciplinary team. Say generally the baseline representatives are going to have folks from campus security or the university police department. You'll have student affairs representative, a representative from the wellness or counseling services office, and often a representative from the human resource office. BITs tend to be smaller, perhaps 4 to 6 people, but some schools have much larger BIT teams that can include people from academic leadership, the president's office, communications, or legal counsel. So similar to SARTs, as we talked about in the last webinar, Effective Campus SARTs, BITs tend to vary in purpose. The history here is that there was this care team model which focused primarily on problem solving, but now BITs are recommended to do more early intervention, detection, and assessment in order to navigate trends that they're seeing on their campus. So in terms of who leads the BIT, I would say it depends on what the main purpose is. If the purpose of the BIT is primarily threat assessment or response, then often campus security or the university police department will take the lead. If it's more prevention and trend detection focused, oftentimes you'll find leadership within the dean of students or the wellness or counseling services office. Some schools have both a care team which focuses on students of concerns and a BIT that focuses on trend detection. And again, the purpose of the individual group will vary based on what other structures are in place at the institution. And just as a quick note for anybody that's interested in more of a deep dive into what a BIT is, NABITA, N-A-B-I-T-A, is a great national organization, and they have also put out a book, The Book on BIT, which is another great resource for folks that are interested.
Great, thanks, Mike. And before moving on to the primary differences between those two, it sounds like the way that you've outlined it that there are some significant similarities between SARTs and BITs and that they are both made up of interdepartmental representatives. There are similar representatives perhaps that exist on both a BIT and a SART team. I was curious if you or anyone on the call, Danica or Jessica, know of any other acronyms that sometimes BITs are known as on campus, because I know sometimes different campuses call them different things. So are you all aware of any other sort of acronyms that are used to describe this same sort of similar team on a campus?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think I would say the 4 that I hear the most, and for some institutions these are used interchangeably, but there are subtle differences between them. So you might hear care team, which isn't an acronym, it's the care team. There's the BIT team. You might hear incident assessment team, or IAT. You could also hear threat assessment group, TAG. So I think, again, for many schools, this is going to be interchangeably and serve the same purpose. But if you're looking, I think, for more traditional definitions of what these teams do, a care team focuses on students of concern. A BIT team focuses on trend detection, trend detection and prevention, whereas an incident assessment team or a threat assessment group really is focusing on high-level threats or concerns that could affect a campus or have already affected a campus. So they could be used interchangeably, but there also could be subtle differences in the terminology.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I will let either Jess or Danica interject also if you all know of any other terms that your campuses have used that you've been on or that you've seen in your interactions with other folks who serve on these teams.
Just a slight variation for ours here at San Diego, where we call it a behavioral threat assessment and management team. So not too different from what Michael was describing, but the point about it being a group where maybe some of the other response teams on campus interface with is very accurate for us as well. So a CARE team, our SART, all have touch points to our behavioral threat assessment and management team.
Great. Thanks so much, Jess. And I think that's a great point about the differences in terms of what the scope and focus are, which what Mike is going to talk about next. And so the idea that even in terms of another similarity, some SARTs, campus-based SARTs rather, are focused on prevention and policy development and revision, and other SARTs, campus SARTs, are focused on response. So similarly, some BITs may be focused in different areas depending on the campus that you're talking about. So I'll turn it back over to you again, Mike, to talk about what the essential differences are between these two teams.
Yeah, so and I really appreciate that segue, Jill, because I think it's really accurate in terms of what these teams do. I mean, certainly there's the obvious difference, the perhaps obvious difference that SARTs are going to focus on sexual misconduct concerns and BITs are going to focus on all manners of disruptive, problematic, or disturbing behavior, of which sexual misconduct could be included. But there is going to be a lot of difference between institutions in terms of how these BITs are focused, and these BIT teams are focused and the SART teams are focused. I would say if you look at the traditional definitions sorted by NABITA, the Book of BITs, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, SARTs traditionally focus on response, as is implied by the name. So they focus on supporting victims after experiencing an event and helping them navigate the maze of community services available to them. So BITs could focus on response, but I would say, again, in the traditional definition, a lot of their time is spent on tracking, looking at red flags, looking at trends. So you can imagine a situation where a SART notices a series of a particular type of violence and then brings it to the BIT to help with an institutional response. But again, I think those are traditional definitions and it can vary from school to school. I think, as we talked about in the previous webinar, Effective Campus SARTs, it'll really just depend on the vision and mission. And this is just another reason why it's really important that as these teams get up and running, they focus first on establishing what their mission and vision is. That way there are clear delineations between what a SART's going to be doing and what a BIT is going to be doing. If you just kind of jump in without knowing, are we doing prevention, are we doing response, it's going to be much more challenging. So I think that once you have established that clear mission and vision, you can set expectations with the group. What is going to happen if you notice a trend through a SART? Is this something that you manage on your own? Do you take it to the BIT? Do you collaborate with the BIT? You have to have these established up front. So I would say just in terms of other logistical considerations in terms of differences, and there are always exceptions to this rule, I would say BITs tend to be smaller, maybe 4 to 6 representatives from essential offices on campus, which we talked about in the last slide. I would say SARTs have similar membership, but often include representatives from a violence prevention office, a respondent services office if one exists, a Title IX office, and at times an external representative from a local advocacy organization. Though the meeting frequency can vary, I think once these teams are up and running, they both tend to meet monthly or quarterly. Both tend to have a coordinator or chair, though that person who is chairing or coordinating each team is going to be different. I would say the BIT team tends to be coordinated by a member of campus security or student affairs, whereas the SART team tends to be coordinated by someone from a violence prevention or a Title IX office. We spent a lot of time in the last webinar talking about running a good meeting, and I think those strategies apply to both SARTs and BITs. I think that includes things like creating an agenda, taking minutes, and creating professional development opportunities. Although I would say, and this is my final difference that I'll talk about on this slide, that in my experience, BITs have done a really good job in infusing professional development into their work, and SARTs could stand to take a lesson from BITs in this regard. BITs have done a lot of tabletop exercise or running threat scenarios by the group, and that professional development should be a component of both SARTs and BITs.
That's a great point, Michael, and I think one that, in terms of, potential takeaways from this webinar, that maybe even combined tabletop exercises between the two teams might be a best practice in terms of when these teams interact so that they aren't so siloed, and a better understanding how those two teams might come together around certain cases or specific threats. So thank you for that. And then I'll let you continue on this slide and talk to us a little bit more about how, when and how SARTs and BITs do work together.
Yeah, that is a great segue, Jill, about doing tabletop exercises or threat scenarios together. That is one way that folks can collaborate, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. I think in terms of how SARTs and BITs work together, as we've been describing, it's going to be a somewhat unsatisfying answer because it's really going to vary from institution to institution. As we've described in the last slide, it's going to be driven largely by the mission of each group and where they overlap or don't overlap. So I would say as you're thinking about this, the easiest way to conceptualize what these groups are doing is asking yourself, does each group do prevention, thinking about trend detection or assessment? Does each group do immediate response, working with a victim directly after an incident? And does each group do long-term support, working with a victim over time? Those that have done this work will often hear this referred to as primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. So once you know, does a SART do all of those things? Does your SART do just secondary and tertiary prevention? Does your BIT do all of those things? Does it just focus on primary prevention? Then you'll be able to understand kind of what this relationship looks like. So in the traditional model where a SART spends most of their time on secondary and tertiary prevention and a BIT spends most of their time on primary prevention, you know that a BIT will be referring a sexual misconduct report to a SART, and a SART will be referring long-term trends to the BIT. But there could be overlap. So asking yourself those questions as you're creating the mission and vision statements of each of these groups on campus is going to be really important to help understand when and how they work together. So once you've established that, here are some baseline considerations. So there's often overlap in membership, which Jill alluded to before, most frequently in student affairs, campus security, UPD, and the wellness or counseling office. I would say both groups typically have a representative from each of those three offices. In my experience, it's helpful to have the same representative be on both so that they can be a conduit between the two groups. The second thing I'll say is that there should be always a direct line of communication between the groups for referrals and coordination. So that could be one of the conduits that are serving on both groups, or you could just have a strong relationship between the two groups and coordinators. The third thing I'll say, which Jill alluded to before, is that some institutions have an annual meeting of both groups or semesterly meeting of both groups, whatever works. My experience with this is limited, but if resources and time permits, it's an excellent way to establish a relationship. It could be things like doing a shared tabletop exercise on some hypothetical incident, but it could also be just shared professional development opportunities like webinars or having one member of a group present to the other group. So all of those are different ways that these groups can collaborate, and I would encourage people to think about once they know how each group fits into the overall institution.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. I'm going to tag Jessica in here, but I think another sort of one of the things I was thinking about just now as you were talking about new opportunities that arise for these two groups to come together is, like you mentioned, the idea of shared professional development opportunities, but even in the terms of the changing national or sort of state-by-state landscape, but looking at it from a national perspective around the changing guns on campus laws, right, or, carry concealed carry laws that are popping up all across the country, part of which is, in NASPA's purview that we track. And so thinking through, if guns are now allowed on campus, how does that change the threat assessment that's going on through the BIT team, in addition to, what does that look like in terms of, dating or domestic violence scenarios where students are allowed to have those or have those weapons on campus. And so there might be some really good collaborative opportunities as state laws and policies change for those two groups to come together to talk about how that might change the nature of each of their efforts. So just wanted to throw that in there, but I will turn over to you, Jessica, to talk more about how and when these two groups work together on campus in your experience.
Thanks, Jill. I'm really glad you brought up domestic violence and dating violence, because that is one of the areas where we seem to have a nexus of the two groups. So exactly the point you're making. If we, through safety planning or the Title IX investigations or criminal investigations with our domestic violence cases or dating violence cases or even some of our stalking cases, discover that maybe the suspect or respondent does own weapons, we have to have a conversation about does this threat to the individual survivor become a larger threat to the campus community, and that's where we bring in our behavioral threat assessment team to help with that analysis. So that is one of the main areas where we see overlap between the two teams. On the other side is when behavioral threat is meeting and they are discussing a situation, an incident, or an individual where they're not sure if there are components of gender-based or interpersonal violence. They'll often bring members from our SART team in as consultants to just be the subject matter experts and educate the group about what are some of the dynamics you should be looking for, assessing for, and then how do you need to craft your interventions around that analysis. So our teams have a really great connection because the chair of our behavioral threat actually sits on a bi-weekly meeting with our sexual assault response team. So behavioral threat meets not quarterly, but sometimes they have to call the meeting to respond to urgent situations. But our sexual assault response team meets every 2 weeks, and we hold our off-week times for those urgent consultations if we need to convene members of behavioral threat with us or just the SART team alone again. So I hope that kind of clarifies how we do work together when we're identifying maybe incidents that could impact the larger community and pose a greater threat.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jessica. And it's actually really fascinating to me that you said that the SART team meets every other week, whereas the BIT team meets less frequently unless there's an urgent need. And so I don't know why, but I would have had in my mind that it would have been the opposite, that the BIT would have been meeting more frequently and the SART maybe less frequently. So but maybe I've just been on college campuses too long and where everything feels urgent. But so I think it's really interesting to think through how often those folks that serve on those teams are having to meet, right? And especially when you're talking about law enforcement members who may have expertise in one or both of these areas, and they're being tasked with serving on both of these committees. That's pulling them away from doing their regular job, right, which may be responding to crises on campus. And so the idea of how frequently these teams meet and when and how there's overlap and when the two need to convene together, your comments were really helpful there. So I will turn it over to Danica to talk a little bit about this slide specifically from her experience as well.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, so I will actually reaffirm your thought about how these look with my experience. So as Jill said, and then Mike also shared, with overlap in membership between SARTs and BITs and considering meeting fatigue and all of that, I think it is important to be really thoughtful and intentional about how these meetings are structured. Excuse me. In my experience, I have seen the BIT meet once a week and or as needed, so it could be canceled if necessary, or I guess unnecessary to meet. But it could also be, they could also be called together more frequently when it's necessary for campus safety. I know that one of the things that we've navigated on Missouri campuses is the tendency to use technology. So, you know, it would be a lot easier perhaps to send an email or send a text or have some kind of group chat, which can be very useful and great for real-time consulting. However, it's important, like I said in the Effective Campus SARTs webinar, to also consider law and policy. So again, Missouri, for example, is a sunshine state or open meetings state, and meetings can be defined fairly broadly. So it is important to just understand where that information could go and where there are protections in place. Now, again, in my experience, SARTs meet once a month with time built in to consult. So on my campus specifically, we started establishing a 50-minute meeting where everyone had the time held on our calendar for an hour, but we would wait until, 05 to meet and then adjourn at 55. And those 5 minutes before and after the actual formal meeting could be spent, of course, just catching up, networking, meeting new people, but also doing some of those corner of the room conversations about, we need to connect about this case or where is this going and those kinds of things. So that we found really important with, just folks being spread so thin with various job responsibilities, but then also the need to connect with new folks as they came into these roles that often have high turnover. And so, really understanding how the different dynamics are in play and kind of working with them can be a great way as you're planning and strategically planning these groups.
Great, thanks so much, Danica. And Jess, I know that you wanted to make an additional point on this slide before we move forward, so I'll toss it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. So your point about kind of thinking reverse of how our teams meet, I just wanted to clarify that a bit, that the reason our behavioral threat assessment larger group doesn't convene as frequently is because we have our SART team meetings at the biweekly scheduling, but we also have our student of concern team, our care team, that meets weekly. So those two teams basically are kind of the ground level assessment teams that feed into the larger behavioral threat assessment group. We also have a kind of a structure where we have co-chairs of behavioral threat, and those co-chairs meet way more frequently than quarterly. They meet probably at least once a week, if not biweekly for sure. So I think that that's hopefully clarifying that our behavioral threat is always present, but in the kind of on-the-ground group meetings of SART and our care team that help. It's that two-way kind of team communication that we have going on.
Thanks so much for clarifying, Jess. And I think that it's important to note that you can have both a BIT and a care team, which, we were talking about earlier, the different team names. And so, especially at larger institutions like yours, that may be the case. And so I think about, again, from someone who's in a community agency who's working with these campuses, that this can get really confusing. And clearly, I come from a campus setting, and I also find it confusing. So I think it's really just important to know that, these teams exist, and then to, you can ask around, and if you, are in a community agency, or maybe you're just doing this work on a campus and you don't have interface or aren't a member of a BIT team, asking about how frequently the BIT team works and how that how your SART may interface with the BIT team would be really important. So both for those who are in the community and working with campuses, but also those who are doing this work on campus, just to better understand the different ways that students are supported on campus when there is a crisis. So thank you so much for clarifying that. So we'll move forward to talk a little bit about conflicts between the two teams, which can arise, and then also how those conflicts can be addressed, because we don't want to just point out the problems that can arise, but also provide suggestions for how we might better some of those conflict situations between the two teams. And so I will turn it over to Danica at this point to talk to us about that.
Thanks, Jill. And I want to be clear, these are not necessarily examples from my institution. I, was thinking about doing this slide. I thought, gosh, it's going to sound like we've got all the conflict. But these are themes that have come up when discussing with various colleagues from various sizes and types of institutions. So this is just kind of the pot they all came into. So structure-wise, that alone can create a little bit of a conflict. And what we see is that, SARTs are made up of a lot of the subject matter experts. So, of course, hyper-focused on sexual violence, relationship violence, sometimes stalking, sexual harassment, whatever else might kind of fall on that continuum. But that can also lead to a little bit of pigeonholing. So depending on the makeup of the broader SART, but also the knowledge of those who make up the BIT, there can be a wide range of knowledge about nature and dynamics about these issues. And that can lead to some conflict, especially when we're in a situation where the SART members aren't involved in the BIT. And sometimes members of the BIT can miss warning signs, especially with domestic violence and stalking. These crimes are so nuanced. I mean, there are just so many different factors to consider, and when you're thinking about things from kind of this big picture standpoint, it can be difficult to really recognize these seemingly small incidents or even patterns as a symptom of something larger. So I hope that's making sense to folks. It is also possible that victims' immediate safety can get lost in the BIT process, especially when considering how to communicate. So when there is an intervention made, particularly with a student of concern, someone who is exhibiting concerning behavior, things like that, if there is a survivor or target known, we know it's really important for safety to make sure that that person has some information about what the decision sanction parameters are. And I feel like I have to speak pretty broadly on this just because there are going to be so many different types of campuses represented, but often FERPA is cited, and the privacy of the individual who is being sanctioned could be cited as a reason not to share with someone else, but I'd also challenge us to consider the kind of need to know clause, and just using really good sense around what is going to be best for both the individuals involved and the institution kind of in the long run. So however that might look, of course, speak with your university's legal counsel and all of that about what that needs to look like. But, as we're planning ahead and as we're thinking about how those possible conflicts can be addressed, thinking ahead of time with strategic planning and mission envisioning and all of that is just really key. So these are some of the things that it would be great for you to address preemptively. We also see kind of an overemphasis on the responding party and a minimization of survivors' needs. Keeping in mind that all of the individuals involved are members of our campus community. In most cases, again, there could be outliers and different things that might come up, but we often, especially getting into, I know in years of training individuals around these tables and different things, we kind of can get focused on the impact to the respondent or responding party or whoever and their academics, their future, all of that. And, just again, another quick layer of understanding that, there are needs on all sides here. We also see self-harm behavior as something that will come up in a bit, but not necessarily a SART. And extremes in behavior. So this person was extremely outgoing and social and, just kind of the life of the residence hall or dorm, but then after one weekend was extremely reclusive, wasn't participating, was no longer involved in the activities, things of that nature. So that might get reported to a BIT without the BIT knowing that violence has happened. So there are so many different things about confidentiality and, procedures and different things there, but that is something to consider depending on your campus policies and the structures in place. And another reason why here I'll insert a little bit of opinion, hope that's all right, but I do feel like it's important to have someone from advocacy or intervention services to be a part of the BIT, even if they are not called upon for their expertise all the time. Just a couple more points, and I promise I will quit chatting at you, but Title IX doesn't always consider BIT-related information in investigations and adjudication processes. And so one of the things that came up in some conversations around this was a consideration around how Title IX might have an MOU about information that they receive that could then inform a BIT case. So that is just another thing to be thoughtful about as you're planning. And with all of this, I just really want to emphasize that we don't necessarily have a blueprint for of answers for all of these issues, but they're super important to know about, prepare for if possible, and then to mitigate in a mutually respectful way when they arise. So, again, in the Effective SARTs webinar, I spoke a lot about going back to our common goals and really to try to stay rooted in that fact when it is difficult to navigate the realities that are going to come up in this work.
Great. Thank you so much, Danica. You've made so many really important points here. And I think, again, back to your point that if you look at what the two teams are designed to do, and that behavioral intervention teams are very often designed to protect the community, the campus community, whereas SARTs are more survivor-centered, right? That they do have different visions and missions, which can lead to conflict, but when you sort of take it back to the start and say, okay, what is the goal of each group? What is each group's purpose? Then you aren't having a SART trying to change a BIT to be more survivor-centered. That's why it's important to have someone from the advocacy perspective, as you mentioned, on that BIT team, even if just as an observer, to bring that that perspective to bear to that group, because that isn't the point necessarily of that group. And I think the other thing too, that I've witnessed in my time on campuses is that the BIT assessment can change depending on who the threat is, right? So if you have someone who is coming in from outside of campus who is threatening one of your students in a dating violence, domestic violence situation, that BIT team may change their approach based on whether or not that person has access to weapons versus if that the abusive person in a relationship is another student, right, on campus, because they just handle those scenarios really differently. And so I think back to the positive outcomes that we talked about on this slide and talking about having clear roles about who shares what. And I know we're going to talk about confidentiality, but I really appreciated your comment about having the Title IX person be the one who has the MOU, something in writing about when and how they share information that they may have with regard to a case that would inform the work of BIT. And protecting the advocate from having to be in that role, because then sometimes it's a slippery slope where then they start asking the advocate for more information that they just aren't in a position to share. So again, I think we've talked a little bit, and I'm going to tag Mike back in here, but back to the vision and mission of each group, and that when each group knows what the vision and mission of the other group is, that can ease some of those tensions, as well as the tabletop exercises that we talked about before. And then, I think the tabletop exercises can help you sort of predict when things might come up that would be sticky issues, whereas if you don't have time to do tabletop exercises, sometimes debrief sessions between the two groups about particular cases or particular threat scenarios that overlap between the two teams might be useful. And we talked a little bit about debriefing in our other webinar on effective SARTs. So with that, I just wanted to reinforce what you said, Danica, because you had such great information on this slide. And so I'll turn it back over to Mike to close out this slide for us.
Yeah, I just briefly want to highlight that I think a lot of what Jill and Danica are describing are important and should be documented in your policies and or any other publications that you have about these groups on campus. So if you haven't listened to the last webinar, Effective Campus SARTs, we spoke extensively about where you can publish information about these groups. And so I'd encourage you to listen to that. So if you have a website that has information on them or a policy that has information on them, you want to be clear about what each group does. And then I think Danica brought up a good point about FERPA. In that policy and in your FERPA policy, which you likely have, you want to ensure that that covers you. It covers your ability to share information among the groups within your need to know or health and safety emergency exceptions that you would be putting in your FERPA policy. And then the final piece about this is that once these policies or websites are published, you have to make sure that each member of one group knows what the policy is on the other group. And so if you have a situation where that's not the case, you got to get someone from the BIT team to present to the SART team and or vice versa to describe the policies, the purposes of the group. And we talked a lot about professional development opportunities, so that could be viewed as one. So if you feel like the groups don't understand what the other one is doing, then you got to get somebody from one of the groups to present to the other group or in the room, so that is all this work that you're doing with mission and vision setting is clear not only to the community, but specifically to these two groups who need to interact.
Great, thank you so much for that. So we want to transition into a little bit of conversation about how the campus community is made aware of each team, and this, also could go to the surrounding community, and sometimes there isn't a need for the greater community to know that these teams exist or interact. But in terms of faculty and parents, how are your campus communities specifically made aware of both the SART team and the BIT team and the work of each? So I'll turn it over to Jessica and Danica on this slide.
Thanks, Jill. So when we're talking about marketing and you're going to a parent orientation, and this may be a 25-minute session, it's kind of hard to explain the nuances between these two groups. And so what our campus has done is created a hotline where concerned faculty and staff who receive information from either parents or other students about a concern can feed that into the hotline, and that activates our behavioral threat team if needed. So first it kind of goes to our care team, and then if it rises to the level of behavioral threat, then it's assessed there. So we do a lot of presentations during parent orientation to let them know that we take these threats seriously. Many parents in particular and families ask about active shooter situations because the last 10, 15 years on college campuses. So we want to make sure that they know that they have the ability to call our campus police department, because that's one of the ways to activate these teams. They can call the dean of students. That's another way to activate the team. So we're giving them information on just how to share concerns that they have without having to fully explain the structure of the different teams that exist on campus. Because like I said, it's a very small window to try to do that in, and it can be somewhat overwhelming. But one of the other ways that we share information with faculty and staff is that we actually have a course through our staff education and training on how to respond to students of concern. And so in that training, staff are educated about how to identify risk with the students that they're working with or colleagues that are in their department, and then what to do when they see some of those risks and who to share the information with as far as getting access to the hotline. That's been a really effective way of getting everybody on campus on the same page about just see something, say something, that old saying that is still pretty useful and effective for us in how to get the word out and the messaging cemented with our community. In addition to that, we also have a website for our behavioral threat assessment and management. Well, more of a web page, just really explaining the structure, who leads that team, where it reports to. It's under our emergency services here on campus. And then we do talk about our SART, which we call our case management team, on our system-wide website that we have for the University of California. So those are just some of the ways that we make sure that the campus community, but also the families and the incoming students are made aware that we do have mechanisms in place to address concerns that the eyes and ears are hearing and seeing on the ground.
Jessica,
That's
love
fantastic.
that. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Jill.
No, that's okay, Danica. I was just going to tag you in, so go ahead.
Oh, perfect. Okay. So, yeah, Jessica, I really love the piece about the hotline, and I feel that, everything that you mentioned was definitely, should definitely be considered best practices with communication and everything kind of in general. The question that I wanted to speak to was one that came up, in discussions about this, about being addressed in our policies and handbooks, because, our campuses are so, so much guided by our official policies and procedures that it's very important for the risk management team or, the University General Counsel or something like that to be involved in the creation of the BIT in order to make sure that kind of everyone is protected in this realm of trying to protect students. I would also encourage folks to have the same considerations for SARTs, or if you're kind of revamping your SART, things like that I think would be really useful just to make sure that everyone is protected and not expected to do more than is within the scope of their role.
Great. Thank you both so much for that. I think that's really important information, and the teams can only function in as much as people are able to identify threats and notify them. So the ways that those groups are made public is really important. So we'll transition to our final slide here, and we want to spend a little bit of time talking about sort of the sticky issue about how confidentiality and victim safety play into the relationships between these two teams, and the processes of sharing information when it comes up when one team needs to know information about another and there are confidentiality issues at play. So I'll turn this over again to Jessica and Danica to tackle this, this heavy issue.
Thanks, Jill. So as a staff member within our confidential survivor advocacy center here on campus, this is definitely an area that we struggle in kind of finding that balance, but also making sure that the privilege we hold with the communications that we have with our clients is upheld and maintained, but also weighing when we know maybe they're living in a situation where roommates are at risk or folks on their residential hall area or within their student employment. And so one thing that's really kind of addressed this for us is that, and there's kind of the pros and cons, but 2 years ago, the University of California created a system-wide sexual violence and sexual harassment policy that basically designated all staff and faculty as responsible employees, with the exception of our counseling and psychological services, as well as our confidential advocacy programs. So with that being said, students who often are not reporting information, or maybe are only coming to the confidential resources on campus, more often than not have shared or experienced these issues where witnesses or responsible employees have discovered them and needed to report them to the university. So sometimes that reporting mechanism to a third party or a responsible employee is how these cases make their way into the light. So when that happens, then we're consulted. And I mentioned in our last webinar, the effective SART, that we work really hard with our clients to receive written consent through a release of information consent form to attend these case management meetings or these behavioral threat meetings, and just confirm that we're working with these clients, but also to make sure that we're getting information that will help assist with safety planning and just basic safety needs that the survivor may have. So I do think that there is a possibility and there are ways to navigate this, but back to what we said in the previous slide, you have to have written documentation, you have to be consulting your campus council, and you have to make sure that you're asking really good questions in these meetings. So maybe you don't have the authorization from the survivor to speak on their behalf, but as the advocate in the room, you are the subject matter expert, and you can ask really pointed questions to your colleagues about some of their own methods for assessing the information they're gathering on their end. So I think there's a way to really navigate this without compromising the confidentiality of the survivors that we're serving.
Absolutely, Jess. I think that when we are considering these, these policies, these practices, it can be really easy to get kind of bogged down in the weight of the process. Well, what's going to happen if this, and what about this, and what about this? And when we can kind of keep in mind that knowledge is power, and that at least for survivors, in my experience, those unknowns are really the most traumatic pieces for survivors through these processes. And if we can just be crystal clear about, here is where your information would go, if it is okay for me to speak with this group of individuals about these issues, here is what I'm hopeful we could accomplish through that, not putting any weight on the survivor to change campus-wide policies and things, but to really try to help have an impact on their case or their safety specifically. Just being very transparent around that to the extent possible can be really useful and can help kind of curb some of those feelings of concern around where this information might go. A couple of things that the group thought of to consider moving forward, and again, I'm not going to pretend that we have, all of the answers on this, but again, just floating those questions out there, having you take this back to your teams with strategic planning processes and, potentially reorganization. Think about how the BIT gets involved in reintegration cases with respondents. So for example, if a respondent, a student, has been separated from the university or campus for a period of time, and then is allowed to come back after, completing whatever it is they agreed to complete. When and how is that information then shared with the SART team? Is that completely housed in the Title IX, space? Is that, are we speaking with admissions? Are we speaking with HR? If it is, someone who maybe they were removed from campus as a student, but then they have gone back and applied as staff, or have gotten a job on campus or on campus property that would reasonably put them, in the position of causing a threat to the greater community or that specific victim survivor. So those are just some things to consider, some things to play around with. Again, speak with your teams. You all are the experts on your campuses, and we are just so thrilled to be able to help kind of get you thinking about these things in new ways.
Great. Thank you both so much, and it's just such great information. Clearly, we could have about a 4-hour webinar on this in terms of thinking through these two groups and how they navigate their collaboration together. So I want to thank all of the panelists today. All of our contact information is here on this slide, and I know that any of us would be willing to chat through the topics that we've talked through on this call with you, or on this webinar with you. If you are looking for some best practices, or looking for campuses that have a really great website where they discuss what their BIT team does or their SART team does, that you can reach out to us, and our contact information is here on this slide. But I just really want to say thank you to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center for allowing us to dig in on this issue a little bit more. Hopefully this provides some clarity both to those in the community working with campuses on prevention and response, but also to those who work on campus. And I want to thank my amazing expert colleagues who gave of their time to help us think through these issues today. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jen.
Great. Thank you to all the presenters for their contributions to this webinar. Thank you for listening to this webinar. We hope that it is useful to you in your SART work. And this is how you can connect with the NSVRC. Our social media or social networking sites are listed there, or you can connect with us at nsvrc.org. Again, the SART Toolkit is available at www.nsvrc.org/SART Toolkit. And finally, thank you again for the presenters for sharing, and to OVC for making this webinar and the SART Toolkit possible. And thank you everyone listening for doing great work and supporting survivors and holding offenders accountable.